This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make It Plain.
Get woke.
Folks, we talk about important civil rights legislation all the time, meaning us as in universal. And we tend to emphasize the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Of course, of late, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But one piece of legislation that is not mentioned as often and probably a bit overshadowed is the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which was considered to be the final piece of legislation upon which Dr. King had a direct influence on before he was taken from us. And so whenever we can get an opportunity to see what the state of the Fair Housing Act and its enforcement is, we should take that opportunity. And it will probably come of no surprise to you that there are still some problems. Just like the VRA, the Fair Housing Act has issues and we must confront them. My guest today is from one of our favorite organizations and one of our legacy civil rights organizations at that. He is a counsel in the Fair Housing and Community Development Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. His work focuses on impact litigation under the Fair Housing Act, efforts to increase compliance with the duty to affirmatively further fair housing through policy advocacy, administrative enforcement, and technical assistance, and the provision of legal support to grassroots housing justice organizers. He earned his Juris Doctorate from the University of Virginia Law School in 2013. He has written extensively on the intersection of civil rights law and land use law. He is licensed to practice law in the state of New York and in the District of Columbia. So here today representing the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is counsel attorney Thomas Silverstein. Thomas, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you. How are you and yours faring in the pandemic? Everybody healthy and safe?
Everyone healthy and safe. Just trying to keep it together like everyone else.
Indeed. And obviously you're working.
Yes.
You're filing suits, man. So talk to us about this latest. We're talking about Hartford. The Lawyers Committee has filed suit against Ben Carson and HUD, correct?
Yes. So we filed suit along with several partners, including the Connecticut Open Communities Alliance and law firm Covington and Burling and the clinical program at Yale Law School against not just HUD and Secretary Carson, but also the Hartford Housing Authority, the City of Hartford, and a few other smaller organizations or agencies. And what we're really challenging here is a set of policy decisions that set up low-income Black and Latinx families to fail as they try to move away from an uninhabitable HUD-subsidized building, or 3 uninhabitable HUD-subsidized buildings that the government had allowed to fall into disrepair over the course of decades.
And so these individuals were moved, but they weren't moved properly or appropriately. That's according to the provisions of the Fair Housing Act, correct?
That's correct. So conditions in their buildings have become so unlivable that the residents came together and organized to push HUD to cancel their slumlords subsidy contracts and give them vouchers to allow them to move. But then what HUD did was HUD selected contractors, including the Hartford Housing Authority, that didn't know how to give people a range of options for where to move that would include suburban areas outside of Hartford, and also gave people way too little time to find new housing. So instead of residents having a real choice about where to move and some being able to decide that they wanted to stay in the neighborhood in the north end of Hartford, and that was where their sort of connection to family and religious congregations and their roots are, but others might want to move to a different, suburban community that had a different school district or is closer to their job at like a hospital or a shopping mall. That choice is taken away essentially because with the parameters that HUD put in place and these local actors sort of reinforced, there weren't choices outside of the city of Hartford in a meaningful way for residents as they tried to relocate.
How many families are we talking about?
So we're talking about three different developments, all located within about a 2-mile radius of each other in the north end of Hartford. And the number of families overall is not at the tip of my tongue, but it's a few hundred overall.
Right, but that's fine. I just want to get a sense. We're talking about buildings.
Yes, we're talking about buildings.
We're not talking about just a handful of people.
Yes.
So let me get this straight. HUD contracted with someone that did not inform the families of what their real options were, correct?
That's correct. HUD chose, local agencies that didn't tell families about options to move outside of the city of Hartford, didn't tell families how much their voucher would pay for outside of the city of Hartford, and also didn't give families enough time to meaningfully look for options outside of the city of Hartford. So, if you're trying to move, there's so many barriers that, a low-income Black or Latinx family in Hartford faces in trying to move anywhere other than the neighborhoods that people have historically been segregated into through government action. And if you want to try to break down those barriers and increase the range of choices for where people can move, it takes more time. And they were simply denied that additional time.
Yeah. So there's the issue of mobility counseling, correct?
Yes.
So in the Fair Housing Act and in the legislation, that is provided for. That's a guarantee.
So the Fair Housing Act doesn't speak directly to mobility counseling. What the Fair Housing Act says is that HUD, as well as any other federal agency that administers housing programs, that could be the VA or the Department of Agriculture in rural areas, has a duty to affirmatively further fair housing, which is a term you used when you were sort of introducing my background. And that means that for HUD, it's not just enough to not discriminate. HUD is held to a higher standard, and what HUD has to do is actually take affirmative, proactive steps to dismantle the state-sanctioned segregation that HUD's predecessor agencies helped create before the Fair Housing Act was enacted. And we believe that one of those key proactive steps that HUD really needs to be taking in this type of situation is providing mobility counseling.
Mm-hmm. And there was also the issue of, you mentioned the deadlines.
Mm-hmm.
Those were not realistic for people to be able to relocate, correct?
That's correct, because it takes longer if you're trying to use a voucher to move to a white suburb, and all of the discrimination that folks are going to face, and all of the barriers that folks are going to face, and the challenges in transportation in getting out there to tour different properties. It's going to take longer to have a search for a new home that includes those areas than one where you're looking in a sort of narrower radius right around where you currently live. So
how much time were these families given, Thomas?
In general, they were given 120 days, which is really, really challenging to do this kind of search in that amount of time. That's made even more difficult and more complicated by the fact that all the folks from these buildings are moving at the same time. So, usually when people are issued vouchers to move it, with someone coming off of the Section 8 waiting list and getting a voucher for the first time, it's not a whole bunch of people getting a voucher and trying to move at the same time. It's sort of a sort of gradual turnover of people who have this type of assistance. But if you're trying to relocate hundreds of families at the same time, or even dozens of families at the same time, in an area where there may not be a huge number of vacancies, that actually makes it take longer as well. So it was about 120 days as an initial matter. And then there were instances where the deadline was extended, but there's a real difference between having a realistic deadline to begin with and having an unrealistic deadline that's then extended, because you can't plan around extensions. You can't, and it sort of drives folks into panic mode.
Yeah. And so this 120 days, Thomas, when did it occur? Is this a recent 120 days?
So, as I mentioned earlier, there were 3 specific developments in Hartford that had these conditions and where the residents were given vouchers. And the relocation processes happened in a somewhat staggered way. So everyone from each building was being relocated at the same time. But the first building, the relocation process was happening around 2 years ago.
Okay.
And then for the subsequent 2 buildings, it was mostly in 2019. So generally speaking, sort of 2018 and 2019 is when most of the relocation activity was occurring.
And so where have these families ended up today?
So a hugely disproportionate portion of the families have ended up back in the city of Hartford, oftentimes back in the north end of the city of Hartford, which is the most heavily Black and Latinx part of the city. And struggling with the real legacy of decades of disinvestment, to the extent that folks were able to move outside of the city. Oftentimes the places they were able to move to weren't the sort of kind of exclusionary white suburbs that for decades have erected these sort of barriers to people moving in. It was some of the relatively few more diverse working class suburbs, places like East Hartford, Connecticut, New Britain, Manchester. Meanwhile, you've got places like Simsbury and Glastonbury and Avon and all these sort of, overwhelmingly white suburbs that kind of have been engaged in what we sometimes call opportunity hoarding over the decades, which is where, you've got these metropolitan areas, got these regions that are carved up into so many different municipalities. And there are places, often predominantly white, affluent areas that have a lot of property tax base, and they keep their resources, their high performing public schools, their parks to themselves. They hoard those resources in order to not more equitably share access to opportunity for everyone who lives in a given region like Greater Hartford. Yeah.
So they moved from segregated Hartford to outside of Hartford and was still pretty much segregated, correct?
Yeah. So most would have just been moving within Hartford, and right. Narrow exceptions to the rule where folks are moving outside of Hartford were mostly moving to areas that were maybe not quite as segregated as Hartford, but are not the areas that HUD should be taking really concerted action to make available.
Yeah. The term you use, I want to get it right. Did you say opportunity hoarding? Is that
opportunity hoarding?
Right. So does HUD, vis-a-vis the Fair Housing Act, have the authority and ability to relocate people and give them vouchers into some of these opportunity hoarded areas? They can do that, right?
Absolutely. So, of course, at the end of the day, the choice as to where an individual family lives is always needs to reside with the individual. But HUD can break down the barriers that make it harder, much harder, and sometimes practically impossible to move to some of these opportunity hoarding areas. So HUD can, when you get a voucher, historically the way it would work is, say you got a voucher for a 2-bedroom unit, and the HUD and the housing authority, if you're in New York City, NYCHA would say your 2-bedroom voucher is worth such and such amount. But HUD has authority to make changes to make that amount more realistic. So one thing that's historically been a problem is that the amount that the voucher would pay for wouldn't be enough in, say, Glastonbury, Connecticut. And HUD has authority to influence that. HUD has authority to change that. HUD has the authority to pick a contractor to carry out its relocation that has a proven track record of administering vouchers across cities and towns within a metro area. And they didn't do that. There actually is a Connecticut state agency, the Connecticut Department of Housing, has a voucher program that operates across this whole metro area. HUD specifically chose not to use them for this and to use the Hartford Housing Authority's program, which only focuses on the city of Hartford instead. Similarly, you've got all of the sort of the barriers that people face that mobility counseling can help break down, whether it's, credit checks or criminal background screening, or just, excessive security deposit requirements and all of this stuff. Mobility counseling can help break those barriers. Mobility counseling can help, inform people about opportunities they may not have been aware existed. And HUD can meaningfully provide for that, and they didn't. HUD, in this case, chose a contractor to help advise families on the relocation process called Loomis, which is one of the the sort of antagonists in this lawsuit. And that they chose someone who had no experience providing mobility counseling, whereas there are plenty of folks around the country who know how to do it because it's been done. There's a proven track record.
Hey peeps, it's your girl, Danielle Moody, host of Woke AF Daily. Every weekday, I'm sounding the alarm and keeping you woke to all the pure evil that is going on in our country. Check me out now at patreon.com/wokeaf. Get 5 new shows every week for just $5 a month. Get woke and stay woke as fuck.
So, in this particular case in Hartford, Thomas, is this unique, or has HUD under Ben Carson been doing this elsewhere around the country? In other words, is this just an isolated situation in Hartford?
So this is not an isolated situation. In some ways, what's happening in Hartford is it's a cautionary tale, because the first piece of the answer to that question is there are a lot of HUD subsidized properties around the country, whether it's public housing that's administered by a public housing authority like NYCHA, or whether it's with what's at issue in this case, which is called project-based Section 8, where HUD administers it directly rather than a local public housing authority. There's so many issues with horrific conditions in subsidized housing in the country, and so many places that are already uninhabitable for residents, or will be very soon if there's not real serious investment in rehabilitating properties. So we know that there are going to be places where HUD is going to have to help people move with vouchers in an emergency situation because their properties become totally unlivable. And that's something that spans every region of this country. There are a few examples from recent years of housing authorities and HUD engaging where you've got these sort of really dire conditions, and how does the sort of relocation process for tenants work, particularly out of the Midwest, out of Illinois and Indiana. And HUD has been inconsistent in how it's dealt with those relocation processes. There was a situation late in the Obama administration where HUD actually did provide for mobility counseling for people who were moving from really, really uninhabitable public housing development in Illinois, in downstate Illinois. But, under Secretary Carson, it appears that HUD has forgotten that that's possible. So I think, there haven't been a huge number of examples of this sort of relocation type process within HUD making all of these wrong calls in terms of how it goes. But if HUD isn't prepared to do better the next time, it's something that we'll absolutely see again, because we know that many of the properties that HUD subsidizes are really in rough shape because of the disinvestment over decades. We
can see the situation worsening under the circumstances. So that's an important piece of information. Yeah. The Obama administration implemented mobility counseling. Ben Carson, under his HUD, as you said, use your word, seems to have forgotten it. Yeah. The suit that has been filed, tell us about the process and the timetable when we might get a hearing or see some relief. Sure. So, when you file a lawsuit against the federal government, they have 60 days to respond. The federal government gets a little bit of extra time. So since we filed this yesterday, we would be expecting the federal government to respond. Actually, I guess it would be right before inauguration time.
And then, from there, it really becomes a question of, do they try to get our lawsuit dismissed? If they don't, we would move on to discovery and getting documents and taking depositions and all of that. And then if you go all the way through to trial, it can be a long haul, and it can be it's a tough fight. And I think we know that justice delayed is often justice denied. So, I hope that this is a really strong lawsuit. I believe very strongly in the claims here, and I hope that now that folks can see this powerful lawsuit on the record, that there may be some consideration of rethinking what's happened and trying to address the wrong that's been done to the residents of these properties who've really, this above all, this is about them and their needs and their futures and their families. And I think I would love to see a sort of coming together at some point to try to figure out a solution. But if we go all the way, if this goes to trial and litigation, that is a long road to hoe.
Yeah, but worthwhile. In the meantime, would the lawyers' committees be that a new administration would do better when it comes to the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, and for that matter, is the lawyers' committee speaking with the incoming administration that isn't being allowed to transition office? Have you all been in communication? Because again, we talk about the VRA. Everybody said we got to get a new VRA, right? We got to fix that. Is there any agenda as far as the lawyers' committee is concerned to strengthen or undergird at least the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act?
Absolutely. So it's very clear that a new HUD has to do a few key things. So two are kind of closely related to each other. Under the leadership or lack thereof of Secretary Carson, HUD has dismantled and rolled back two really important regulations that the Obama administration put into place related to the Fair Housing Act. One is about an issue called disparate impact. So disparate impact is where you can prove a violation of a civil rights law, in this case, the Fair Housing Act, without proving discriminatory intent. Instead, you show that the policy that you're challenging disproportionately harms a protected group, such as, Black families in this case. It could be people with disabilities. It could be, families with kids. Fair Housing Act, covers a lot of different protected characteristics, and that there's no, justification or good reason for that policy. So Secretary Carson has put out a new regulation just back in September that if, in terms of HUD's own administrative activities, and then also this could, in a worst case scenario, percolate into the courts if the courts agreed with HUD's view, it would make it basically impossible for a plaintiff to succeed in any disparate impact claim. So when you're talking about how to dismantle structural racism in housing, this is really a very serious body blow to those efforts. And undoing that regulation needs to be a really high priority for incoming administration. The second one is affirmatively furthering fair housing. Back in 2015, the Obama administration issued a regulation on affirmatively furthering fair housing, which was really an attempt, for the first time, a really serious attempt to get states, local governments, and public housing authorities to develop meaningful plans for how they were going to proactively attack discrimination and dismantle the legacy of state-sanctioned segregation. And that also has been repealed as of August of this year. So that's got to be a top priority for an incoming administration. The last thing I'll say, which is maybe a little more mundane and less glamorous, is, these 4 years or, 3 years and 10 months have been devastating for the morale of staff at federal agencies, including HUD, but not just HUD. There's been a lot of, institutional knowledge and skill and expertise that's been lost because people just had to get out because it is, just a, terrible place to work. You've been, disempowered from doing your job, enforcing civil rights. So there's going to be a critical need for a new administration to just invest in people and training and hiring and really getting it so you don't just have the right rules in place, but you actually have the human capacity to enforce them.
Yeah. No, those are all good points. You mentioned Ben Carson. Once I had Jonathan Allen, who's a reporter for NBC, on my show. And in either intentionally or in a Freudian slip, referred to Ben Carson as Secretary of Cabins. You may get that later. It's in Uncle Tom's Cabin, because we've seen his own contradictions. But back to the suit, though. So what I'm thinking of now is they themselves have packed the court. Asked Biden and Harris, are you going to pack the court? Wrong question. Are you going to expand the court? They've packed it. So as an attorney in this business, do you start looking at and maybe handicapping, well, where is this going to take place? What court will this be in? And will we draw the straw of one of these unqualified, never having served or tried a case judges that the Trump Carson, so to speak, administration has propped up? Is that a concern?
I'll taking a step back from this case in general, thinking nationwide, absolutely 100%. I think as civil rights lawyers, we have to think strategically about what we try to accomplish through litigation and where we file, because there have been real setbacks in terms of the courts, in these recent years. I would say that in the context of this case in Connecticut, that the federal district court in Connecticut still has a set of really good, really qualified judges, and the damage has not been as great there. But outside of the context of this case, I think those are things we have to think really critically about. And the changes in the composition of the courts overall also, it's not just a question of whether to file. It can be a question of, if you face a setback in a bad decision, do you appeal? You have to look at, who's on the appellate court. And then certainly, that's like much less the Supreme Court. You get a bad appellate court decision. This is not a promising Supreme Court for many issues. Now, sometimes there are issues where, existing law, cases that have already been decided, are so, helpful and clearly on your side that the case that you're pushing this time, the fight that you're waging this time, you can make the calculation. It's probably not the one where you're going to see the conservative courts, kind of picking as an example to roll back civil rights. In other words, there are some issues that are more vulnerable to being dealt with the wrong way by a hostile judge than others, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. But again, just to be clear, so these, it sounds to me like if these families were treated in this way, some of them have been relocated. They're living where they're living. What's that like for them? I'm living in a place that may not be the most desirable. And now, not only that, I'm aware, living there, that I should have been afforded a better option for myself. How is that living comfortably and harmoniously and the pursuit of happiness?
People are tough and people are resilient. They'll try to make it work the best they can. But, absolutely, there are folks who they've expressed, their dreams and their desires for a different type of environment to live in, to raise their kids in, whether it's a neighborhood where they feel more safe walking, down to the corner store at night, whether it's, having a school, an elementary school in their neighborhood where they know that their kid is going to get a good education. And frankly, like more basic things where like the heat's going to work in the winter and there won't be lead in the water. There's absolutely an awareness of how people's dreams, their aspirations, and the things that they really have a legal right, I think it is argued, a legal right to be able to grab hold of has been denied to them. And, at this point, that initial move out of these three developments, it can't be undone. They are where they are. But there are absolutely things that HUD and all of these local agencies could do to give folks the opportunity to try again, and to try again in the right circumstances where they actually, have a real choice, where they have the support they need, the time they need, the information they need to be able to move where they want.
Yeah. And thank God they have the Lawyers Committee to help them and your work as counsel. Folks, you can read more about this. You can Google the story because it's heavily, it's a lot of coverage in the news about this suit and what happened to these residents in Hartford, Connecticut. You can also go to lawyerscommittee.org to find out more as well. And so we'll watch this and hopefully as well, with the new administration coming in at this hour, we have reason to believe that is still going to happen. We can encourage and lobby and pressure the new administration to be sure that HUD lives up to what the Fair Housing Act is there to enforce. And that is very, very important. Thomas Silverstein, of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, has been our guest today. Thomas, thank you, buddy. Keep us posted on this case, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
And for that matter, please stay in touch as an ongoing resource to inform the public about where this is happening elsewhere and in other parts of the country, as well as the effort and the movement to bolster the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. Like I said, it gets a little overshadowed in terms of the other legacy civil rights acts. So please feel free to play that role for us, okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, buddy.
Take care.
Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. Please remember to listen, like, subscribe, and wherever you get your podcasts, please give the show a 5-star rating. And please do spread the word. Let's all continue to pray for each other during this pandemic and this police-demic. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.